Failing Church, Unfailing God is the title of this series, and our prayer is that that will change. 2 Corinthians 1 to 11, and that's going to be our goal as we get together in the catacombs. And as if you're part of that study group, part of what we're doing is to focus on, to pay attention to dig into, what does God have for me, not just a word for me, but for my life that is life-changing. Verse 1, Paul, an apostle, we're going to look a little bit at him in a moment. Apostle just means sent one. Can also mean missionary, like everybody is an apostle. We're all sent into this world, but there's a technical term for the original sent ones, those who saw Jesus' ministry, those who touched him, who knew him. And so this is what he's talking about here, and we'll learn a little bit later on about that. An apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. The idea of a desire here is God's desire, not to be confused with decree. God decreed the earth into being. He desires that all men and women will come to him. He desired that Paul would serve him, but a decree is different than a desire. There are things God decrees, and there's things that God desires. And there's a lot of talk about that today, and if you want to talk more about that, I'd be glad to anytime. God desired that Paul would serve him. Well, who is this Paul? He was a Pharisee. He was a religious professional who did not know Jesus. He knew about God, and he was a professional in going to and doing the things that religious people do. Religion is man reaching for God, and salvation is God reaching down to grab a hold of man. And that is the difference. And he was a Pharisee. He was a Jesus hater. Not only did he not accept Jesus as Messiah, but he was really stirred up and cranked up about this Jesus, and he did not like him. He was at Stephen's death. Remember Stephen, first deacon? Those of you who are deacons, hopefully you're not going to fall into this, but this first deacon, he's dragged before the religious professionals, and he starts telling them about Jesus. They go like foaming dogs. Like, ever seen a dog so mad that it's foaming at the mouth? Their teeth are chattering. They can't even control themselves. And they pick up stones. They start hurling stones at Stephen because they're going to shut him up one way or the other. Stephen looks up and goes, "Hey, there's Jesus." I mean, exactly what they wanted to hear. And they finish the job stoning him to death. The last thing he says is, what did Jesus say on the cross? "Father, forgive them." They don't get it. They don't know what they're doing. Imagine if you're the guy throwing the stone, the last stone that hits him in the head, totally crushing in his brains, and that's the last thing you hear. Wouldn't that mess with your mind? Well, that's Stephen. It says Saul was there. They were throwing the coats at their feet. He's going like, hey, take your coat off. Put your coat down here. You'll get a better aim with your coat off. A little more hurl behind the rock. That's Paul. It says he went out terrorizing. It says breathing out death is the words that the Bible uses. Like Paul was like, he was out to do Christianity in. Followers of Jesus, he did not like till he's on this road to Damascus, and a bright light comes, scares him spitless, and he's left blind, groping around. He sees Jesus before he goes blind. Jesus talks to him and tells him some things, and he's like, "Why are you persecuting me? Like, why are you like this, Paul? Why don't you get it, Paul?" And you know the rest of the story. The one who hated Christianity now becomes the one who is the major proponent over the next number of years, who goes all over the world giving this message that Jesus is the Son of God who came to save men and women from their sin. And that's who wrote this letter to this very messed up church. And I kind of wonder how God is going to use it. And Timothy, our brother. Timothy's there as well. Timothy is one of Paul's students. He was an elder in the church as well as a church planter with Paul. Here's who this letter is to the church of God, which is in Corinth, with all the saints who are throughout Achaia. I mean, it's just broader than the local church family. And remember, God's church. It's God's church. It wasn't the church at Corinth. It wasn't their church. This is not our church, not the elders' church, it's not the deacons' church, it's not even your church. For the church has but one leader, and that's why John says, don't call anybody leaders, because you have one leader, and that's God. We are servants in the church, and this letter is to the servants in the church because it's Jesus' church, no one else's. And he has a message for the church. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. This letter is from God on high, from the hand of Jesus as it was given to Paul, and he shares this message with the church. Grace. Who remembers what grace is? Right. Grace is not getting what I do deserve, which is the opposite of mercy, which is what we're going to look at later, not getting what I deserve. Grace is getting what I don't deserve. Peace is an exemption from the rage and havoc of war. Remember Israel? They're just leaving Egypt. Moses has done his miracles, or God's miracles through him. Pharaoh says, get out of here. Pharaoh has a memory lapse and goes, you know what? There's a lot of free labor leaving the country. I think we should call them back and maybe put them back to work again. So here is Israel, edge of the river, Red Sea. Red Sea in front of them. Egyptians behind them. They are done for. There's nothing they can do. The Egyptian army is far superior. They have horses. They have men, outnumbered them, and arms, and then like a superior force. There's nothing they can do in what comes down between them and the Egyptians. God. Pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. They could not handle this. Only God could handle this. He brought peace. They no longer had to strive and fight because God fought for them. Paul says, grace to you, peace. That's tough because we want to fight for ourselves. We want to do our own thing. We somehow think we can get our own thing going and that we don't need God. We only need God for the really... God's saying you need me for peace in your life. And so that is Paul's prayer, God's prayer for them, is grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, our kind of conclusion sections we're calling words to the messed. Are you messed? I'm messed. I know you're messed too. Even if you don't admit that you're messed, you are messed. So here's some words to those of us who are messed up. Don't despair when it looks like the enemies of God are greater than you are. Are you there? Have you been there? When the things around you look like they're greater than you can ever imagine on being able to cope and being able to handle, God is there. Number two, the enemy of the church became the servant of God. That should tell us something about God. That one of the greatest enemies that the church has ever seen became God's servant. And God still does that. Some of you are praying for people. Some of you know people who you don't think will ever come to Jesus, who you don't think will ever change. If God can take this guy down in the road and wrestle him just like he did Jacob to the point where this guy will then turn and become the greatest proponent for Christianity that the world has ever seen, he can handle the person that you're praying for. Number three, there are people that you love who appear to be the enemies of God. Pray. We're going to learn a little bit more about that this morning. There's no heart too cold, no heart too hard that the truth of the gospel cannot reach. And I can say that because mine was a very hard, cold heart. I was the guy in youth group hooking other youth group members on drugs, laughing at the preacher, laughing at the youth group leader. And one day, my world changed, and God's finger stuck its end in my nose and said, "Who are you?" And I realized I was nothing.